Good morning, and welcome back to Practice Makes Perfect, installment number 5. Today and next week, God willing, we will be going into surveying the practical aspects of Judaism, namely the mitzvot, the commandments. And today we'll focus on the different divisions of the commandments, the different categories. Next week, we'll go into a lot more of the specifics, give you a sampling of the 613. We already discussed the division of the commandments into the positive and the negative, the prescriptive and the proscriptive. And I just wanted to add one more insight before we go on to the next divisions. When God relates to us, He relates to us in two ways. One way He relates to us by showing His relationship with us, His closeness to us. In philosophical and theological terminology, it's called God's immanence, spelled with an A as opposed to immanence with an I. It's God who wants to be part of our world. He wants to identify with us. And therefore, we have to identify with Him by doing things that are godly. That's what a positive mitzvah is. It's God's way of saying, I am relating to you by way of you relating to me, by doing things that make that relationship a reality, by cementing my connection that I have to you. So the positive commandments are the commandments that God gives us that relate to God's relationship with the world. So they really tell us how He wants us to shape our world, our micro world, and also the macro world, because one is an extension and reflection of the other. The negative commandments relates to another aspect of God, God's transcendence. God in His true state transcends being involved in a world or in creation. One of the things that sets apart Judaism from Greek philosophy, Maimonides devotes much of his Guide for the Perplexed to this, is that Greek philosophers, Aristotle and Plato in different ways, posited they believed in a God, but they believed in a God who is either parallel with the world, a God who is equated with world, with nature, pantheistic thought where God and nature are synonymous. And Judaism always negated the concept of a God that is part of the world, and that's it, or even is greater than the world but parallels the world, as if the world and God are co-equals. God, by definition, transcends creation. There's no reason why God had to create the world. We often imagine that existence had to be. No, it did not have to be. It became because God made it happen. Once it happens, God identifies with His world. So God is both immanent, He's both part of this world, and He's also transcendent. So when you do a positive commandment, you're affirming God's presence within this world. You're accepting God's role within this world, and you're cementing that relationship and creating a perfect world, an ideal world. But there's another aspect that we have to recognize, that God negates existence. God's essence is beyond existence. By following the negative, by the proscriptive, what we are doing is negating the world the way it is. We're saying, no, the world is not the ideal. The world is not, there's something beyond this world. Another way of putting it is that in human nature, there's a part of us that loves to conform. We love to be part of a group. We love to belong to something. And there's a part of us that always wants to be independent, iconoclastic, maverick. We're always looking for breaking away from something. Where does that come from? It comes from the fact that our soul, which is a part of God, has those two elements. There's a part of our soul that wants to be part of this world, and there's a part of our soul that wants to break away. Well, how do we express those two parts of our emotions and make them holy and godly when we conform in a godly way and when we rebel in a godly way? So how do we rebel in a godly way? When society tells us, do this is great. And you say, no, we won't do it because God doesn't want us to do it. So we're rebelling against society. And that way we capture both aspects of God. But then there are other divisions. The division of the mitzvot, of the commandments, into what is called man to God and man to man. Man here, generically, of course, includes women. There's no other, if you think of a better way of putting it, humanity to God and humanity to humanity. This doesn't sound right, but it's obviously not intended to exclude women. When we look at the 10 Commandments, they were given in 2 tablets. Why 2 tablets? God could have put everything on 1 tablet. Why did it have to be 2 tablets? It's even more cumbersome for Moses to carry. It's easier to schlep one thing than to schlep 2 separate tablets and keep them together. Maybe that's why he dropped them. Or wasn't there originally 3 tablets? Oh, that's in a movie, I think. Yeah, very. So it has 2 tablets. Why 2 tablets? So we're told that the first tablet represents the set of commandments that are man to God. I am the Lord your God, don't have any other gods, don't bear my name in vain, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy, and honor your parents, which you could say, well, that's not man to God, it is. The Talmud says that parents are God's surrogate here in this world. When you honor your parents, you're honoring God. So that first tablet is man to God, primarily. The second tablet is entirely man to man. Don't commit murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, and don't covet. Yes?
If he differentiate have honest to things from to love.
Absolutely. Honor does not mean love. Love, you can't command someone to love their parents. If they don't really love them, there's something wrong, and commandment is not going to help. They need a therapist. That's where you come in, kids. But honor, you don't have to love someone to honor them, to give them respect and honor. So it is more of a sublime thing where you show respect for higher authority delegated by God to parents, and by extension to other people in positions of leadership, teachers and leaders and so on and so forth. So we have 2 tablets. Why are they divided into 2? To tell you that they're both equal. If it would have been 1 tablet and they would have been written in order, you would have said, okay, number 1 through 5, those are the more important ones. 6 to 10 are the less important ones. So they're both equal tablets. You can't make one tablet more important than the other. The person who says, I'm a good Jew in the synagogue, but in business I'm a crook, is missing something. Or the one who says, I'm a charitable person, I'm a good person, but I don't have any relationship with God, they're missing something very important. You can't have one without the other. And ultimately, one will suffer without the other. If a person says, I'm a firm believer in God, I'm very pious, very righteous in terms of my relationship with God, but I'm not honest in my dealings with people, that shows that they really don't respect God, because of the same God that wants you to love Him wants you to love others and wants you to treat them with respect and not harm them in any way. So a person who says, I love God, but I hate everyone else, doesn't really love God. You can't love someone and hate the people that person who you love loves. So God loves us and everyone. We can't say, well, we hate everyone, but we love God. So there's a little problem with that division. It doesn't mean you're a hypocrite. It just means that your love of God or your respect for God is lacking in depth and in its ability to really make a difference in your life. The same way, if a person is only man to man, only has the social niceties that Judaism wants us to be part of our lives, but doesn't have respect for a higher authority, well, that's very good. But it probably won't last, because human beings are human beings, and we have self-interest, and when my self-interest collides with someone else's self-interest, we have a fight, and we have a war, and we start killing each other. We used to be friends, but now we're not friends anymore, and that's what happens in society, because a person who bases his social consciousness simply on their own feelings will discover that their feelings could change with the passage of time. Circumstances can make you change. You have to have both. And even with both, you're not guaranteed that you'll keep them both. We're still limited. We're humans and we have our weaknesses, but we have to have both to reinforce one another. And that's why when Moses carried the tablets, he carried them together horizontally. They were not carried one on top of the other. I don't know what, when CNN reported on it, I don't know how they, I have to go back to see the footage, but it was two tablets, equal tablets together. And by the way, the tablets were not round on the top. That's Michelangelo creating that. The tablets were cubes, two cubes put together, and they were held one next to the other. And there are some people, some commentaries, and this is not the time and place to go into it, they read the Ten Commandments not the way we normally read it. We normally read it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They read it 1, 6, horizontally. I am the Lord your God, don't commit murder. Why? Because murder shows that you don't respect God's image, that every human being is a representation of. We are all created in God's image. Don't have any other God, don't commit adultery. Don't be unfaithful to God, don't be unfaithful to your spouse. And it goes on. It gets a little bit more complicated as we get to the next ones, but they're all parallel commandments. You could read them both ways, vertically and horizontally. Judaism wants us to integrate these two different areas of mitzvahs. Then we have the division of mitzvahs into three categories. They're called statutes, testimonies, and judgments in English. Then the English translation doesn't do justice to the Hebrew. In Hebrew, we'll start off with the commandments that are called chukim, plural, chok, singular. The word chok, they translate as statute, simply means a law that is etched in stone. Chok has the root of the word for engraved or etched. If someone tells you that their words are etched in stone, they mean to say, this is the way it is. It cannot be any other way. Those are the commandments that were given to us by God, for which no reason is apparent, for which no reason is given and no reason is apparent. You don't have to give a reason for everything to make it reasonable. Sometimes you could figure it out yourself. But there are things that were given to us. The prime example is the red heifer, the red cow, which was used in a purification ritual for someone who came in contact with the dead. It doesn't make any sense. There's no logic behind that ritual. Why does that ritual do anything to purify someone who had become defiled, ritually speaking, by coming in contact with the dead? It's God's commandment, and the Torah prefaces that by saying, this is the statute of the Torah. This is a law that has no rational basis. Then why do we do it? Because God says, this is what I want you to do. Then you have testimonies, eidos, testimonies, commandments that are designed to testify to certain events, commemorative commandments. The most obvious example, of course, is Passover. The mitzvahs that are associated with Passover, they are there to commemorate historical events. Events in which God did things for us that we are obligated to constantly remember, and not just remember, but relive. Excuse me. So by the Seder, when we sit down to eat the matzah, we're not remembering, simply remembering the past. We're trying to relive it and experience the idea of bondage by eating the bitter herbs and by drinking the wine, the freedom, and so on and so forth. These are mitzvahs that are there to remind us. Included in this category would be the Sabbath. It's a reminder of God creating the world. Included in this category would be a mitzvah such as tefillin that men put on. It's a reminder. It's a constant reminder of our Jewishness. The mezuzah is a reminder that we believe in one God, and we affirm that belief by putting it on the doorposts of our homes. There are many mitzvahs that are designed to remind us of our Jewishness, of God, of our relationship with God, of historical events. They are all lumped together in one category called eidos. Now, if they would not have been given to us, if God would not have given us these commandments, would we have followed them? Probably not, but they make sense. Once they're given to us, no one will say they defy reason. Everyone knows it's quite reasonable and normal for human beings to want to commemorate certain events. If God had not told us to observe Passover, we might not have done it. But once he tells us to do it, it makes a lot of sense. And the third category is called mishpatim, judgments. These include the laws of all criminal law, don't kill, don't steal, the social laws of helping your fellow, giving charity, lending money, don't cheat in business, all these things that relate to commerce, to interpersonal relationships, social obligations. These are more or less dictated by logic. Even if the Torah had not told us not to commit murder, we would have probably figured it out on our own. It's not good for your health. And if we would allow people to kill their enemies, the enemies would then fight back and kill you. So if you want to survive, you're better off observing these laws. These are reasonable laws that would have been dictated by logic, by reason, by many societies, and many societies have these laws even though they don't have access to the Torah. So these are the three categories. In fact, the Talmud says if the Torah had not been given, humanity would have developed a sense of ethics and morality by observing animals. Because animals, though some of them do things that we don't want to emulate, like pouncing on your neighbor with your claws and ripping them to shreds like a lion would do when it's hungry. You don't want to emulate that, but you do want to emulate certain traits that animals have that humans are a little bit in short supply of. We would learn, the Talmud says, we would learn theft from an ant, not to steal. We would learn modesty from a cat, and so on and so forth. So there are commandments that the Torah gave us that we would have anticipated even without the Torah. But God still gave it to us. Why? Because by giving us the reasonable, the logical commandments, God is elevating the things that we do based on logic to a higher level. They become godly. Not only is there a greater guarantee that we will observe them, if somebody knows that there's a God who's watching over you, and you believe that God wants you to desist from a certain course of action, that might motivate you to desist. If you wouldn't have that sense of God is watching, you wouldn't hesitate. You know, they tell the famous story of a rabbi in a wagon with a coach driver. They're passing an orchard, and there was some luscious grapes hanging over the fence that were, of course, belonged to the owner of the orchard, to the vineyard, and the wagon driver is about to pluck a cluster of grapes off, and the rabbi said, he's watching. And quickly he leaves the cluster of grapes, and he starts whipping the horses to go as fast as he can, so that the owner of the vineyard doesn't catch up with him. And he turns around, and he doesn't see anyone chasing him. So he asked the rabbi, who was watching? He says, God was watching. Oh, should have. I thought if it was serious over here, that might have been his reaction. But the Talmud says, if you would sense God's presence and you would feel God's watching over you the same way that you feel another human being watching over you, we would desist from a lot of things. We wouldn't do a lot of things. There's a lot of things that we do only because nobody is there. If someone would be there, we would refrain from doing things that we don't do in public that we might do that we don't think is right in private. So the idea of having even the rational commandments become part of the corpus of divine commandments is to guarantee that we will heed them, number one. But also, number two, it makes them become a different level of commandment. They're not just done for our own selfish interests. The truth is that there are three things that human beings need to have in order to be good human beings. And every society develops one of these three. Judaism has all three in these three commandments, these three categories of commandments. There are times that we do things only because we have a higher authority. Sometimes it's the police. When you see the police car on the highway, you slow down. It's the fear of getting a ticket. It's simply fear of a higher authority. You would normally speed, you wouldn't care. But if there's a higher authority or someone who has more power than you, you're going to obey the law and you will not violate that. That's one way of getting people to shape up, by having power over them, exercising authority over other people. Another way is by generating a sense of inner spiritual godly energy within you. When you realize that your goodness, your sense of ethics comes from within you, that ethics and goodness are innate to the human condition. Some people don't believe that, but some people do believe that a human being has this innate goodness, and if we could somehow connect to that spiritual energy within us, we would become better people. So we have to focus on inner reach, reaching into our inner self and developing and actualizing that potential that we have that's very, very spiritual and ethical, and that would make us better people. Many cultures have that, and that's what makes them good people, because they look for the goodness within them. They draw upon the reservoir of goodness within. And each culture has a different way of defining that goodness, some a little bit more spiritually, some a little more secularly, but it comes from within. And then you have a third approach to ethics and morality and goodness, and that's social consciousness. Nothing inside of you is telling you what's right or wrong. You don't care about authority, or authority is not really exercising its authority. But you realize that if I'm going to behave in a certain way, and others will behave that same way, we'll have anarchy, we'll have conflict, we'll self-destruct. So there's a sense of social consciousness. We care about, let's say people care about the environment. Why do they care about the environment? Not because God has told them so, not because someone is going to punish them, not because there's an inner voice that they hear, but they feel if we're going to destroy the environment, it's going to affect, it might be in my backyard, but it's ultimately going to affect the whole world, and they're going to affect me. So let's have a social consciousness. Now, which one of those three is the best approach? What do you think? Which is the best approach? Respect for higher authority, whatever the higher authority is, finding the inner voice within you that tells you what to do that is good and right and ethical, or social consciousness? Which is the best approach? All of the above. You can't really have a perfect approach if you only rely on one. And it's self-evident that each one of those is flawed, because people who even believe in God will sometimes forget that God is watching. Sometimes we speed, even though we know there might be a policeman there. We feel, we're not going to be caught. So we don't respect authority, and we do the wrong thing. Some people feel a voice from within them, but how can you trust an inner voice? How do you know where it's coming from? Maybe it's something that you ate that day that's causing you to feel something stirring within you. You don't know that it's necessarily the right thing. And social consciousness is a very effective way of getting people to behave in a certain way up to a certain point. Because after a certain point, everyone thinks, well, I'm going to do... the story where the king was coming to a town where they made wine, and he set up the date when he's supposed to arrive, and they put a big barrel in the center of town, and every vintner was supposed to take his best wine and pour it in the barrel. So when the king and his entourage would come, he would taste the best wine in the world. It would be paradise. Well, one vintner decided, why should I waste my good wine? I'm going to put my bottle of water inside the barrel instead of the wine. And of course, everyone thought the same thing, and the king drank pure water, H2O. There was not a drop of wine in it. If everyone thinks, I can get away with it, it's not going to harm anybody because I'm doing it myself. So social consciousness by itself is no guarantee of good behavior. When you have all three together, you have a rope. It's made up of three different strands, and they're intertwined. They're not separate. That rope will not sever very soon. That's a biblical phrase, that a threefold rope will not fall apart, will not unravel very quickly. That's how Judaism has all these three. The judgments are the social consciousness commandments. The testimonies are the ones that try to stir up spiritual feelings, connecting us to historical events where God took us out of Egypt, trying to relate to the spiritual feelings within us. And then we have the chukim, the commandments that have no reason. They're done strictly because God says, I'm the authority with a capital A, and I say so. So when you do all these three, you hone your respect for authority, you develop your inner spirituality, and you also perfect your sense of social consciousness. So all three are necessary. Then we have another division. We divide the mitzvahs into biblical and rabbinical. Now this is going to require a little bit of elaboration. The word biblical sounds like if it's written in the Bible for Jews is the 5 books of Moses, the prophetic books, and then the other books called Ketuvim or Hagiographa. Have you read your Hagiographa today? It's not. The Hebrew is just as good as the English. Most people don't know what either mean. These are parts of the Torah, 24 books in all. That's what we say when we say Bible. We don't refer to it as old because there is only one Bible, and it's old, and it's present, it's new, it's all combined. That is the source of Judaism. That's a given. So if the Torah says, let's take from the 10 Commandments, you should honor your father and mother, that's a biblical commandment. And likewise, all the other 612 commandments are taken specifically from the 5 books of Moses. Those are biblical commandments. But if you look at the Torah, there is no way that any sensible human being could figure out what exactly the Torah wants us to do or not do just by reading the biblical text. There is much more that is left out than is put in there. It becomes very clear to any serious student, Bible student, that the Bible was written as an outline, as a sketch, that people who knew the whole story would be able to tell you every other part of it, but for people who didn't get the background information, you're left in the dark. And this is true this is true about the narratives, about the stories in the Torah. Sometimes you get a half of a story, and you know that something is missing. And sometimes you don't even get a half a story. You just get a few fragments. There was a great rabbi who was trying to get the Tsar to rescind a decree against the Jews to keep them away from border areas. And the reason why the Tsar was so concerned about Jews living in the border areas because he said, I can't trust these people. And he quoted a passage in the Talmud that said something to the effect that a certain bird laid an egg and it destroyed many cities. And he says, if Jews believe in this nonsense, you can't take them seriously, so I can't trust anything they say or they do. So the rabbi who responded said, if you would now, someone would now write a letter and tell someone that a drop of ink came out of the Tsar's pen and it obliterated 100 Jewish communities, would anyone have a question what it meant? We now know in the context of what you're trying to do is to obliterate Jewish communities, we would understand the metaphor that ink came out of your pen with which you signed the decree to obliterate all these communities. It said when the rabbis wrote these things thousands of years ago, 1,600, 1,800 years ago, about an egg that destroyed communities, The people in those days understood what that metaphor, they had the context. We don't have the context, so we don't understand what it is. The same is true about the Torah. The Torah was written in a way that if you don't have the context, if you don't have the subtext, if you don't have the information, you cannot go by the Torah, by the Bible, by the 5 books of Moses. It's an unintelligible book, and it was not intended to be read by itself. This is the Jewish belief, and it's borne out by just reading the Torah, because there are so many laws that are so cryptic that it's impossible to ever apply them in real life. The best example is the one about don't doing work on the Sabbath. That's just one of hundreds of examples, but that's the best example. How does one define work? If you go around this room and you ask everyone in this room how they define work, we'll have different opinions. So does the Torah make it subjective? No. The Torah says it's a law that the courts had to enforce. It's not up to the individual if you go by what the Torah says. So it's obvious that the Torah, when it said don't do work, didn't have to tell you what work entailed because everyone knew what it meant, based on the context in which it was given. We call that the oral tradition. When God gave the Torah to Moses, he told him to put certain things in writing, and other things he says, don't write down. I want you to transmit that orally. So that every commandment, even the one, let's say, not to commit murder. I mean, I just gave you a translation of the word tirtzach, and I translated it as murder. You'll look at some translations that say it reads don't kill. Well, what does killing mean? Murder is already an interpretation. Killing is a lot more basic. So what does killing mean? You can't step on an ant, you can't swat a fly, you can't kill a mosquito, you can't kill a person in self-defense, you can't fight a war of defense, you can't execute a vicious criminal. If that's how you interpret it, then you're coming up with a very difficult dilemma. Where do you draw the line? So obviously, there's certain things that you don't have to rely on the oral tradition. The Torah itself says that we're allowed to fight a war, because they did fight wars in those days. So we know that you could fight a war. But how do you know what is forbidden, what is murder, that is a crime in Judaism, and what is killing that is not a crime? Well, you could use common sense and say, well, self-defense is one thing. But what's self-defense? How do you define self-defense? Self-defense in American law is not so clear-cut. If someone comes into your house to rob you, could you kill the person? Yes, but it depends where, it depends what direction he's going in, it depends. There's so many details. Every legal system has so many details. The Torah doesn't give you any of those details. Neither does it give it to you details about murder, does it give details about the Sabbath, about how to observe the holidays, and so on and so forth. So there's an oral tradition that tells you what the Torah means, and that's what we mean by biblical laws. We mean the Torah's statements combined with the oral tradition's interpretation. But that's not the extent of it. There are certain laws, not very many, but some, that are not even hinted in the Bible, or not mentioned in any form, in any way, as opposed to others that are written but need clarification. There are some, I'll give you an example. The classic example is in the temple, in the days of old, there was a ritual that they did every day to pour wine on the altar. On the holiday of Sukkot, they would pour water as well as the wine. We're not going to go into the reasons why they would do that. This was a point of contention between the traditional Jews, the traditionalists who followed the oral traditions, and the Sadducees who rebelled against the oral tradition, going back to the days of the Second Temple, talking about over 2,000 years ago, well over 2,000 years ago. And they claimed that there's no such thing. The Torah doesn't mention anywhere that you're supposed to pour water on the altar. And this was a major bone of contention. Think of things that we can argue about. But this was a deadly argument because one time the high priest who bought the office, he was a Sadducee, he was rich and he bought the office of high priest, and when he came to performing the ritual of pouring the water, he poured it on his feet instead of the altar. It was a way of saying, I don't believe in this stuff. And the people there were thousands of people in the temple, had their esrog. You know what an esrog is? An esrog is an innocuous fruit, but when 5,000 people throw the esrog at you, it hurts. And that's what they did. They pelted him with their esrogs, and he unleashed the soldiers that were there, and there was a massacre of thousands of Jews because of that incident. That's just an example of how it became a very serious bone of contention. But that was one of the laws that were passed down orally that are not even mentioned in the Torah. But they were passed down from one generation to another. Those are considered to be of a biblical status. But then the rabbis are always trying to make trouble. And they decided, you know what? 613 is not enough. Not enough commandments, not enough restrictions. We're going to make life miserable for everyone. We're going to add on more restrictions and more laws. The truth is, the Torah obligates the rabbis to do that. It's not their right to do it, it's their obligation to do it. There are several biblical verses in which the Torah says, I want you to create protections to the laws. And in another verse it says, whatever the rabbis, they don't call them rabbis, they're called judges, tell you, you have to follow. Don't stray from their words right or left. This is all in the book of Deuteronomy. The rabbis were given the authority to legislate new laws that were designed to protect the existing laws. There are many areas of law that if we would just go by what the Torah says, it would be very easy for people to violate. So the rabbis added on safeguards. The metaphor for that is, you tell an alcoholic not just not to drink alcohol, but don't even enter a bar. You might even go a step further. If you have to walk from point A to point B, don't even pass the bar, unless you're a lawyer. Bad joke. Why? He's not drinking. But it's a safeguard because he has a weakness, and if you put him too close to the source of his weakness, he might succumb to the temptation. So stay away. That's the nature of rabbinical laws, and especially in the area of the Sabbath laws. On the Sabbath, we're not allowed to do a lot of things. There are 39 categories of work that we don't do on the Sabbath. That's how the biblical law was defined by the oral tradition. The rabbis extended some of them to include, I'll give you one example, something we call muktzah. Muktzah means any object that has no real defined use for the Sabbath. So we don't write on the Sabbath. We don't even handle a pen or a pencil. We don't light fires on the Sabbath. We don't even carry matches. You don't move matches from one place to another. We don't handle things. Money we don't handle. Money, there's nothing biblically wrong with handling money, but since money is a thing that you don't use on the Sabbath, you can go up buying and selling, we don't even handle the money on the Sabbath. These are examples of rabbinical extensions that they instituted in order to protect the biblical laws. That's one category. Another category is where they saw that society is in need of new legislation because things are happening that are causing problems. And they decided to outlaw certain things that were permissible before. For example, this is in the Ashkenazic countries, polygamy was always permissible in Judaism. Rabbi Gershom, the great sage who lived in Germany over 1,000 years ago, banned polygamy. All other segments of society allowed polygamy. Judaism might have been the only one, at least in that area, that said no polygamy. And that became a rabbinic law. Why did he ban polygamy? There are all sorts of theories as to why. Some say he had 2 wives himself, so he knew from experience that it wasn't a good idea. But whatever the reason was, he instituted a ban. So there are additional bans. The rabbis also did other things, legislated other things to protect the community from some violations of biblical law. For example, the prus bowl. not to be confused with the Super Bowl or the Rose Bowl, the Cruz Bowl, is the enactment to be able to collect your debts after the sabbatical year. There's a biblical law that says that when the sabbatical year arrives, your debts are automatically canceled. I wish the IRS would observe that law. So then the Torah says that should not stop you from lending money to someone who needs money. But human nature is such that when people know that there's a chance that your debtor is going to stall repaying the loan and wait for the sabbatical year to be over, and then the debt is canceled, so people stopped lending. So Hillel, the famous sage, enacted the Prusbol, which is a legal device which enabled you to collect debts by accessing a law that was already part of the law of that sabbatical year, that when you hand your debts over to the court before the sabbatical year begins, or before it's over, according to most opinions, then the debts are not canceled. It's like today, if someone owes me money, then I submit it to the courts, and it's in collection, then it's no longer a debt. It's now the collection agency has it. So Hillel just took advantage of a biblical provision, and he instituted that everyone signs a prosbol before the end of the sabbatical year. Some people do it before the onset of the sabbatical year to guarantee that debts will not be canceled. He didn't change any laws. Some people bring this as an example of how you could change laws. He didn't change anything. He just made the provision so that everyone is protected. Another example, according to many opinions, is the ketubah, the marriage contract. The marriage contract, according to many opinions, is not a biblical institution. It was designed by the rabbis to protect the interests of women, because women in society were always the second-class citizens, and they would have been cheated in a marriage or divorce settlement, or in case she's widowed, and she wouldn't get and it would be easy for the husband to divorce her, and she would lose all her rights. So the ketubah was designed specifically to protect women. This goes back thousands of years, but it's a rabbinical law. That's just an example of the things that the rabbis instituted. The holiday of Hanukkah that's coming up is a rabbinical holiday. The rabbis instituted the lighting of the menorah. The rabbis instituted the lighting of Shabbos candles. It's not mentioned in the Torah to light Shabbos candles. The rabbis said this is a way of enhancing the joy of the Sabbath, the honor of the Sabbath, the peace of the Sabbath. So they instituted that. The rabbis instituted reciting the Hallel, Psalms during holidays, praising God for the miracles. They instituted reciting blessings before eating. The Torah, the Bible, only says you should thank God after you finish eating, by saying the grace after meals. The rabbi says, no, even before you eat, you shall thank God because you have the opportunity to eat. So these are examples of rabbinic laws that were instituted to protect the biblical laws, to protect society when biblical laws didn't cover certain eventualities, and laws that will enhance our Jewish experience, commemorations that were not around in the days of the Torah. The Torah gives the rabbis that license to do exactly that. Then we have the division of all the commandments into 6 orders of the Mishnah. When the oral law was transmitted orally, people had to memorize everything. And people, how do you memorize things? By repetition. It was not uncommon for people to study something 100 times. If you studied it 100 times, that was considered to be routine. If you did it 101, you were already doing something special, out of the ordinary. But 100 was considered the routine, that every rabbi studied what he learned 100 times. Even a name. Someone told you a certain law in the name of Rabbi so-and-so. The Talmud says that certain rabbis would repeat the name dozens of times to make sure they don't forget who the author of that statement was. They were so careful in trying to memorize things. A time came when that was going to become impossible, to retain all of the knowledge and to not forget any of it. So they allowed for the oral tradition to be put into writing. This happened in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, as he was called, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, also referred to as Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy rabbi, also known as Rebbe, just the teacher par excellence. He edited, compiled. There's a debate whether he actually wrote it or he just put it together for his students to put into writing. But either way, he is the one who compiled, redacted, what we call the Mishnah, which he divided into 6 categories. This contains the oral teachings, the basic, the rudimentary, the fundamental oral teachings in the 6 areas of Jewish law, and they are agricultural laws. Judaism not only requires that you eat kosher meat, but your agriculture has to be kosher, and it covers a whole wide range of things that we have to make sure, especially in Israel. Most of the agricultural laws apply to Israel. Next week we'll go into some of them. Then the second order is called festivals. It deals with, of course, as the name itself tells you, all of the Jewish festivals, including the Sabbath. The next one is called women. It deals with laws that pertain to marriage, divorce, and other issues that come from marriage and divorce, other types of issues, adultery and so on and so forth. Number 4 is damages. This covers all, basically, criminal law as well as civil law. The laws of damages, the laws of theft, murder, the laws concerning business, partnerships, and so on. 5th is holy things, the laws that concern the Holy Temple in Jerusalem and the sacrifices there, as well as the laws of kashrut, the Jewish dietary laws. And then 6 is ritual purity, the laws that pertain to ritual purity, such as the laws of the mikveh, and all the other areas of law that some of which do not apply today because we don't have the temple, but were a prerequisite for entering the temple. You had to go through ritual purification processes if you ever went to a funeral, if you ever came in contact with certain dead animals, and so on and so forth. So these 6 orders, as they're called, each of them contains tractates. There are a total of 60, an average of 10 per order, that cover different specifics within these 6. And then Maimonides, 1,000 years later, divided all of Judaism into 14 categories. And these are the 14. Knowledge of God. The first book is called the Book of Knowledge. It deals with the fundamentals of Judaism: knowing God, loving of our fellow, rejection of idolatry. The second one is called Adoration, or Love. The Book of Love talks about our prayers in which we express our love for God. The different rituals that we fill in, the mezuzah, they're all contained in that section. Then he has the seasons. That covers the holidays, the Shabbat and the holidays. Women is the same as the Mishnah, covers the laws of marriage and divorce. And 5 is holiness. This deals with forbidden relationships, laws about incest, laws, other areas that are forbidden, as well as the dietary laws that are designed to make us more holy. The next one is promises, the laws that concern our word. Very interesting difference between Jewish law and secular law. In secular law, you could break your promises 1,000 times. You can make pledges all you want all day long. It doesn't mean anything. In Jewish law, a pledge to charity that you do not keep is considered to be a serious crime. 7 is seeds, forbidden mixtures that we, mixing different plants. Tithes that we have to give to the poor, to the priests. Service deals with the laws of building the temple, sacrifices, communal sacrifices, and temple rituals. The next one is the Book of Sacrifices, which deals with private, personal sacrifices, purity, contact with the dead, ritual purity. The mikveh, damages, is the same as the Mishnaic one, Torah, theft, murder. Acquisition deals with commerce, the laws about neighbors and their relationship, their arguments, about property matters, partners, partnerships, Judgments deals with the laws of renting things, loans, and inheritance. And judges deals with courts, witnesses, deals with the laws of kings, the laws of the Jewish government. Then the laws concludes with the laws concerning the Messianic age. I already went into the rabbinic mitzvot. I gave you examples. Here are some more examples. The washing of our hands before eating bread. The Eruv, which is a very interesting institution, which I would hope someday we'll be able to go into more detail and more depth. There's an Eruv that is being built here in Buffalo, not in Buffalo, in Amherst. We won't even notice it. It's like a barrier, a wall around the community to allow you to carry within that area, because the area is considered to be enclosed by posts and wires over it. And we use the telephone wires to be part of it. It's an interesting subject, which you'll be hearing more about, I'm sure, in the next few months. The blessings I already mentioned. The Shabbos candles. Purim is considered a rabbinic, even though it's in the Bible, but it's post 5 books of Moses, so it's considered to be a rabbinical law, especially when there are other aspects of Purim that are rabbinical. Hanukkah, I mentioned. Hallel, the Psalms that we recite during holidays, that's rabbinic. And the reading of the Torah that we read every Shabbos, that is not a biblical obligation. Nowhere does it say you're supposed to read the Torah on the Sabbath. That's rabbinical. It goes back to the days of Moses, but it's still rabbinical. Moses was a transmitter of God's word, and he also was a rabbi who was empowered to add on new instructions that were relevant at that time. Then we have the rabbinical prohibitions and enactments. I already went through some of them. The extensions of the Sabbath prohibitions I mentioned. The extensions of kashrus prohibitions. The example of that is you can't eat milk and meat mixed together, cooked together. The rabbis prohibited any type of mixture of milk and meat, including even chicken or turkey, even though it's not technically meat, because the Torah talks about the milk of its mother. Don't cook a kid in the milk of its mother. That would exclude, of course, fowl. It doesn't have mother's milk, but the rabbis extended it to include the fowl as well. Polygamy is an example I mentioned. The pruzbul I mentioned. The sale of chametz is another example where the rabbis took a biblical law and they provided us with a way of fulfilling it without the hardships that it might entail in modern times. The Torah says you're not allowed to possess chametz, that's bread or anything that has a mixture of flour and water that was not prepared for Passover. That chametz you're not allowed to eat, you can't use, but you can't even own. You can have it in your house, but you can't own it. So in the olden days, what did people do? How much did they have in their house? They had a little bit left. They would eat whatever they can eat, and the rest they would throw out. If they didn't want to throw it out, they went to their neighbor who wasn't Jewish, and they gave it to him. Or if there was a little bit more, they would sell it to him. But now, in modern times, the last few hundred years, people can have warehouses full of liquor, where you can have in your own home, private home, you can have 20 bottles of expensive liquor. What are you going to do, pour it down the drain? Drink all of it? Before Passover, you see a lot of drunk Jews going around before Passover. Now you know why. So the rabbi said, look, let's take advantage of a statement that's mentioned in the Talmud. It's one reference to it, that there were rabbis who were traveling by ship and they couldn't get home by Passover, and they had plenty of chametz in their homes. So they wrote a contract and they sold it legally by way of contract to a non-Jew. So it was a legal, perfectly legal. It was not a gimmick or anything. It was using a legal procedure to disown something that you had in your home. It doesn't cover the law. You can't eat it. It's not permissible to eat, but you are not violating the law of not possessing it. That's a more modern or more recent rabbinical provision. And the ketubah I already mentioned. There's also, quite to most opinions, a rabbinical provision that has protected the rights of women in society. Now, rabbis today don't have the same power that they had then, only because in those days, in the Talmudic period and before that, there was a central authority. All Jews lived in one place, more or less, in Israel and Babylonia, and the rabbis got together and they agreed on whatever laws they agreed upon, so that became the law for everyone. Today, the rabbis in every city, when I say rabbis, I don't just mean people who are even legitimate rabbis, who are well-versed in Jewish law, because it takes someone who's a much higher stature to legislate new laws, even for his own community. But rabbis today do not have the power to legislate any new laws that will be binding on anyone except their own community if their own community accepts it. Once it's accepted, then it becomes a part of Jewish tradition. We're going to discuss next week. We'll go into some more details of the commandments. And I left out one other category of commandment. Those are the customs. Besides rabbinic laws, there are also customs that develop and become law. If, let's say, we get together as a community and we have a nice custom to do certain things in a certain time that are perfect, I'm talking about a positive custom. I don't mean customs that are negative or harmful, but we develop a certain ritual or Jewish tradition that this community thinks of that was never done before, and it becomes accepted by this community over the period of a few generations. That becomes law. Then you're obligated to follow it. It's like Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah is the most joyous day of the Jewish calendar year. Some people will argue maybe Purim is more joyous. So we'll see. How much are you going to drink on Purim and how much are you going to drink on Simchas Torah? And that will determine which day you think is a more joyous day. But Simchas Torah is clearly the most, or one of the second most joyous day of the calendar year. Now, if you look through the whole Torah, I'll make you a bet of $10,000. Someone said that last night. If you'll find any reference to this holiday called Simchas Torah, nowhere does it say there's anything called Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah is a rabbinical holiday added on, as they added on a day to Passover because of the doubts that they had in the olden days when the first day of the month would occur, and therefore you had to keep an extra day, and we still keep it as a tradition. We still keep that extra day. Okay. But where does it say, even in the Talmud, where it talks about the rabbinical laws and the rabbinical holidays, where does it say that it's a day to finish the reading of the Torah and to make a big celebration? It doesn't say that in the Talmud either. It developed as a Jewish custom. And once it became an accepted Jewish custom, it became a mandatory part of Judaism. And to this day, it's universally observed as part of Jewish ritual, no less so than biblical holidays, which indicates and points to the power that we, as a community, we could create customs that have eventually the power of law. Now, of course, every community can have its own customs. So a community that has a certain custom doesn't have to follow the customs of other communities until everyone accepts those customs. So there are universal customs and there are local customs. So you can, right now, if you had to divide communities that are faithful to Jewish law, you can probably have a few hundred different types of customs depending on the community, and some overlap. Now, the theory behind customs and rabbinic laws and biblical laws, and I'll conclude on this note, is when someone tells you to do something, someone of authority, and you do it, what does that demonstrate? That you have respect for authority. When someone doesn't wait to be told what to do, but anticipates what, let's say a parent tells you what to do, and then there are things the parent doesn't tell you, but you in your own mind say, you know what, I think my mother would love if I did this. She didn't tell me to do the dishes today, but I think she would really get a kick out of it if I would do it on my own, because I never did it on my own, and now I'm going to do it. She's going to really be happy. And then you can see the big smile on her face when she sees the child didn't wait to be told. But this is a command, and this is not a command. The answer is, if you're talking about authority, following authority, yes, a command is more important. If you're talking about the side of love, of what you care for that person, the more you anticipate their will, it's a greater expression of love. That's why the Talmud says that God says, I love the rabbinical commandments more than I love the biblical ones. Even though the biblical ones are more important, but the rabbinic ones demonstrate that you're willing to add more just because you care so much about the mitzvahs, you're adding on more, and the customs even more than that. You're developing new ways of again, and you have to be very careful because some customs can be very bad. The word custom in Hebrew, minhag, if you rearrange the letters, it spells Gehenim, which is the Hebrew version of hell. So some customs, let's say in some communities, everyone takes marijuana. Does that become a Jewish custom that you're obligated to smoke weed? No, that's Gehenim. So you have to be very, what? You have to be very careful with customs. But a custom that has a positive side to it, that's accepted by the Jewish community, that is a sign of great love that you're willing to find new ways, creative ways of getting closer to God. So that's why God loves the rabbinic laws. He loves the customs even more. So Simchas Torah, which is a custom, developed out of a custom, becomes the happiest day of the Jewish calendar year.